Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm incredibly excited to speak to Dora Sandra Leon Villa. We are so excited to have her today. You are going to marvel at some of the expertise she has and some of the topics that we never really touch upon in the Latino community that she is here to shed sunlight on. Dora Sandra, welcome.
Gracias. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course. And you're talking to us from Vegas?
I am in Las Vegas, Nevada. It is semi cold. It's kind of nice for December, I guess, for the end of the year, but I'm excited to chat with you. And yeah, where are you at?
Yeah, I'm in Los Angeles. So we are both taking advantage of wonderful winter weather, unlike our New York
Yeah.
friends who, aren't doing so well.
Yeah.
But I wanted to, connect with you. You're one of the very few licensed psychologists, neuropsychologists in the Latino community. I feel that the numbers are under indexed in our community. And you're also the owner and CEO of Innovation Behavioral Health Solutions. And, with that job description and with those really important job titles, there's a lot of knowledge that comes about trauma and PTSD and neuropsychology, things like ADHD. And you also, have a framework for liberation psychology. Can you chat through that liberation psychology framework?
Yeah. So liberation psychology really focuses on oppressed populations. And so it's a lens through which we look at not just mental health diagnoses, but assessment and treatment. And so when we think about liberation psychology, someone that comes to mind is Martin Baro, and he is one of the early pioneers and actually coined the term liberation psychologist or liberation psychology. And essentially, it's giving voice to the oppressed. It's looking at how systems oppress us, how they contribute to our mental health, but also, it goes beyond like a Western lens of diagnosis and pathology, right? Because I think culturally speaking, it takes into account not just culture, but the intersections of being a marginalized individual, having invisible or visible disabilities, and then looking at how the broad systems, right, have an impact on us. And so essentially, Western psychology labels us as traumatized, right? When we're really having a normal reaction to some of the conditions, especially some of the conditions that we're seeing now, right? On a day to day basis. And so, liberation psychology as a framework allows me as a clinician to approach mental health in a way that encompasses the whole and not just the whole individual, but the whole as they are impacted by multiple factors in the environment and in the past, right? Like historically.
Yeah, I want to double click on something that you said when you mentioned, we're typically dubbed as traumatized, and that's not necessarily, the way that we should be framing how we see ourselves. And I love the way that you frame it, which is this is a very normal reaction to what is happening. So do you see that a lot in your practice where you have to take people from, this crazy feeling of, oh my gosh, there's something wrong with me. I'm so traumatized to actually I'm normal and anybody under these circumstances would be acting in this way.
Yeah, I think that specifically Western psychology has a way of like blaming the individual, right? Like you're depressed or you're traumatized or you're experiencing X, Y, and Z and that's where liberation psychology framework comes in, right? As opposed to saying, labeling and saying you, and internalizing that on the individual as if nothing else exists outside of that bubble, right? And so we go from, yes, these labels help us identify symptoms, just like you would go to a doctor, your regular doctor, a physician, and tell them like these are my symptoms, my throat hurts, whatever the case is. And they're gonna be like, oh, well, you have a respiratory virus, or oh, you have a bacterial infection, right? And the same thing within the labels of psychology. We find that like post-traumatic stress disorder is a set of symptoms that helps us identify. But beyond that, it's looking at, like I said, am I traumatized because it's a me problem, or am I traumatized because of all these factors that have impacted my life? And really, this is just a normal way to react. And I think about what's happening in our communities right now, and then just worldwide in general, right? It's kind of like, who is doing okay right now? Who is free of anxiety right now? Who is not struggling to get their work done on a day-to-day basis with everything that we're exposed to, right? So the normal response then is these symptoms. It's, even me as a psychologist, I'm having a hard time initiating my tasks. I'm having a hard time focusing on things, right? And that's the normal reaction that people should be having to a lot of
Mhm.
the violence that we're seeing in our communities and across the world. And so, as opposed to saying, like, this is a me problem, no, this is me reacting normally like a human to everything that's happened in my life or is happening still.
Yeah. And I think that's a very important distinction, especially with everything going on in our communities and how we're being targeted with ICE raids. And, it's like you mentioned, every day it's a feeling of unsafety. So, how are you helping your patients, your clients navigate this tough time? I hate using the word unprecedented because I feel like got overused during COVID, but there's no other way no other way to categorize this. It's unheard of. If somebody would have shown me the videos and, all the content that these raids are producing 5 years ago, I would have said that is not a possibility, not in America. That is not something that we would do. So it feels like we're just, we would never hope for something this devastating to happen. How are you helping your clients and the community navigate such a horrible time?
So, from a liberation psychology lens, I think one of the key components is historical and ancestral remembrance, right? And so you mentioned like these times are unprecedented, but if we think about it, right? And we've been in a way, we've been programmed to think that America is this like beautiful, like land of, the American
Mhm,
dream and
mhm,
all of these things. And so it feels unprecedented and it feels like, how can America do that? But the thing is there is precedent. And so liberation psychology and the way I would approach this, and I do approach this with community, with therapy patients, and even with an assessment, is teaching our histories, teaching our what our ancestors have experienced, right? Because we see what's happening now has already happened. It's just repeating itself, right? When we think about the natives here on Turtle Island or, Native Americans, which are recognized above the colonial border, which is the southern border between Mexico and the United States, we see that, people were getting picked up way back in the day, right? When we're talking about things like manifest destiny, which is what we learned in school. And
mhm.
essentially it's teaching that, God told us these lands belong to us and we got to spread democracy. And so we're going to take your land. And that's really what happened with Mexico, right? When we think about the indigenous population here at the time of colonization,
Mhm.
indigenous children were getting put in detention centers that were called boarding schools, right? People were getting picked up and taken and kidnapped and done all these things. And so it feels unprecedented, but it's not. And so the goal of liberation psychology is not just to recognize that we're not living in a vacuum and these are just our problems, but that these systems that have existed for hundreds and hundreds of years are continuing to oppress us and continuing to exploit us, right? When we think about this immigration crisis, we're really talking about the way that the US has destabilized Latin American countries specifically, right? When we're talking about like the Latino population and caused destabilization there, which then creates an immigration crisis, right? Which is what we hear on the news. And so then historically, we think about when they did the raids back in the day that were the wetback, it was called the wetback operation wetback, right? And that was back when we called it La Migra. Now we call it ICE. And now there's different types of operations happening. So it feels unprecedented. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we are just so exposed to it. We have so much access to it on our phones every single
Mm.
day. And it feels magnified, especially under this administration. But the thing is this has happened before. And so the goal through liberation psychology is to teach you to recognize some of that propaganda, teach you to recognize some of those narratives that have been told to us, right? Including anti-indigeneity, including, that our communities are problematic. Well, why are our communities problematic? Right? Why are our communities binge drinking and relying on alcohol as a coping mechanism, right? To cope with trauma? Well, that we got to go way back to like 500 years ago, right? When the first colonizers arrived in Latin America. And when you think about our colonial histories, whether we're talking about Mexico or Central America, right? It's basically the same story. It's the same playbook, right? We're colonized, we are enslaved, we are massacred, immigration crises happen, right? And so it's not unprecedented. And so the goal with treatment and with approaches to mental health that are liberatory in a way are to teach you to recognize that, to teach you that this is not something new. And then how do we then disrupt the systems, right? To help us improve our well being as a whole.
Yeah, and thank you so much for that brief history that you provided. How do you feel that connecting to the past helps us cope with the future? Like, what is that connection between having awareness of, it did happen before, right? How does that translate into coping in the now?
Well, I think it teaches us that one, it's nothing new, right? Like we've been here before. And because we've been here before, our ancestors have survived this before, right? But it also teaches us to, okay, well, how do we change it? How do we disrupt these systems and the ways that we show up? And it's not just like the histories, right, of colonization. With that also came like white supremacy culture, anti-indigeneity in our families, colorism in our families, right? European beauty standards in our families, right? Where a lot of us even learn to code switch the way we talk, the way we do our hair, the way we might just wear our hair straight, right? We might like leave the hoop earrings at home because we want to be professional. We might like put on our white voice because that's what's deemed appropriate. And so it's unlearning a lot of that. So it's not just remembering the history, but it's also what came with that history and how do we unlearn that so that we can heal? Because there's wounds that we carry beyond just traumatization, right? In terms of internalized racism or internalized self hatred or even anti Blackness in our communities. And so there's a lot of unlearning that has to happen. Like growing up for me, I was called prieta. I was told not to stay in the sun, right? I remember being like an 18-year-old working at like a Bank of America call center and this lady like telling me like put me on the phone with somebody who speaks English because she picked up the fact that I wasn't white, right? And so some picking up on those microaggressions, picking up on some of those things that are subtly like racist but nonetheless hurt just as bad. Right. And so when you unlearn history, you're also relearning new things, right? You learn to appreciate yourself. You learn that your nose doesn't have to be pointed for you to love it, right? You learn that you could wear your hoop earrings and you can show up as exactly who you are and still be competent and still be smart and still be professional. So there's a lot that comes with that and a lot of healing that comes with that too.
Yeah. And I think it's so funny that you mentioned, your example with being called prieta. I think we all have a prieto, negro, these are just the nicknames that we give ourselves in our
Hmm.
Latino families. And sometimes that we use it as a sign of love. But if you peel back the onion layers, you're like, wait a second, like this wouldn't fly. Yeah, or I wouldn't want to say that to my kid. And I know that that has been something that you're right. We have been making permissible generation after generation.
And without realizing that this is programming that we've got because we've been taught that the white way is the right way, right? If you
Mhm.
don't look like a European American woman, then you're not as attractive. If you have a flatter nose and you're not as attractive, if you have more indigenous features, right, then you're not as attractive. And we see that those stereotypes play out even growing up, right? And the programming starts really early. And I'm thinking about like novelas. When we watch novelas, a lot of these are subconsciously sending these messages, right? That the pretty girl is the white passing one, right? And then the
Yeah.
darker complexion people, those are the house people who are helping manage the house and clean up and cook, right? And so we're
I've
kind of
never thought about
very
it, but you're right. Yeah.
even
That's
like
insane. Yeah, yeah, that's insanity. I've never sat down with it, and, I feel this is why conversations are like this one are so important in our community because we go about our lives thinking this is the way, and then it takes, a little bit of awareness around the nicknames we give ourselves or the media that we consume, and the media that not only we consumed, our parents and grandparents were in the room as the media was being consumed, So it's just like,
reinforcing.
compounds generation. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's insane to have awareness around these things, and sometimes that awareness feels a little impossible and crushing to me that it's like, there's so much to overcome and we're so far away from it. Is there one tangible step or like one, recommendation that you can give anyone that is in that journey of kind of bringing awareness around these things, to be able to move through the world without feeling it like a crushing realization.
Yeah, one of the books that I love is by Prisca Lorcas Mujica, and she wrote a book called For Brown Girls with Sharp Edges and Tender Hearts. And it's one of like the easiest reads. It's bilingual, and she basically is talking about her life, but she does it in a way that she weaves in like the unlearning of like decolonial white supremacy messaging, right? And so I would say like start there. Gloria Alzandua was a queer Chicana that grew up on the border of Texas and the United States. And she does a lot of work on, even like our language and how, for me, my parents come from Mexico. And so when we think about like even like Spanglish, right? It's a mix of indigenous words and Spanish and English, right? And so she talks about how we're kind of in like this third, what do we call it? Like third world children where we're like, no somos de aquí ni de allá, right?
Wait, I can relate to that so much. I grew up in a border. You mentioned that this author grew up in a border too. And you're too American for your Mexican friends, and you're too Mexican for your American friends. So you feel like you're from nowhere. And I was never able to put words to that feeling until there was like this one New York Times podcast that played randomly one day, and it was a woman giving an essay about this feeling of being from nowhere. And I just think that that's, also something that first generation children feel here in the US. Like you're not American enough, for the US, but you're also not Mexican enough to be back in Mexico.
Yeah, and then God forbid you have like you're morena, right? God forbid you have like more indigenous features because then you really, right? Like your own culture doesn't value you and then this culture doesn't value you. And so I think part of that unlearning is just learning to pick up on the messaging, the narratives that we've been taught and then disrupting those. And that can look like disrupting them in yourself initially, and then eventually disrupting them, like even within our families. And I find that it is probably the most challenging thing to do. But I think about like my parents, for example, right? Like there's so much anti indigeneity that had happened in the past for them, where like, they would call people like Indias or like Oaxaquitas, which is horrible, right? Like just some very derogatory terms that were normalized, but were very violent at the same time. And having to educate them, right? When they would make a comment like, hey, like that's actually not okay. And then at the end of the day, finding out like, hey, you're like 50% indigenous, mom, right? Like
Mhm, mm.
you are the India you're talking about. Like, what are you talking about? Right. And then I think we've gotten to a place now where they're more cognizant about the things that they say, but they're also very self-aware and even maybe a little proud of our indigenous roots, right? And so I think it starts there. There's has to be an internal unlearning that happens, right? And you can do that through books, you can do that through self-study, you can do that through therapy, but then we continue to disrupt on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. I think as at least I can speak for my culture as Mexicans, we're very full at putting boundaries within the family. It's this feeling of, my parents suffered so much to get me to this point. How dare I tell them, don't talk this way or don't do this. And so is there any actionable tip or any advice that you have for us Latinos that boundaries don't come naturally to us? Like how do we start placing those with our family and saying, hey, maybe that's not the nicest way of saying something, or hey, let me give you some insight as to why we're using these words that probably shouldn't be using.
Yeah, it is really hard to set boundaries. And I think that comes from the fact that our parents have socialized us to think that disagreeing with them, period, is disrespectful, right? Like it just becomes so disrespectful to even challenge your parents. And so we can frame things. And I also think at the same time, people think that boundaries have to be like rude, right? Or they have to like, they can't come across as like kind. And really, boundaries are about us, they're not about somebody else. It's how do I flip that back on myself? Like, and I'm thinking about like weight comments, which happen a lot during the holidays, right?
Mm.
And that comes from European beauty standards as well, right? Because we're taught that thin is the beauty standard. And I think that we can frame things in a way that brings the boundary back to us. Like, hey, ma, pa, I call my parents ma, pa, right? Comentas de mi cuerpo, when you make a comment about my body, it really makes me feel ashamed and it makes me feel bad and uncomfortable. right? And so now that becomes about me and not about your behavior. When it comes to unlearning some of those other, ideas, I think it's also important to take the approach of like wanting to provide information like, hey, I actually learned that the reason we think indigeneity is negative is because of X, Y, and Z. And then how can I teach my family, right? What I've already learned because they have to also have that information to be able to unlearn it and then learn something new, right? We're always in the process of learning and unlearning.
Yeah. And I love how you framed it, instead of making it about like, no me digas eso, or ¿por qué me estás hablando así? To say, when I hear you say that, I feel this sort of way. And I think that's genius because the inclination sometimes is to just go and attack the behavior and attack the person with the behavior.
Yeah. And so I think that's why we're like other mental health supports can support us because we have a tendency to react versus respond. And that's one of the things that I talk to like folks that I work with in a therapeutic space. And so I have a group practice and so I'm also a training site and I'm constantly teaching folks like we work with a majority BIPOC population, lots of like Latinos in the office. But I think that's where it becomes important to learn how to react. Like, what do I need when I'm experiencing something negative? Like, oh, my tia just made a comment about whatever, X, Y, and Z. And I'm starting to feel
La
like some
tía,
way,
yeah.
like, fucking tia, she's always saying something.
Yeah, yeah.
So you start to feel that emotion coming up. And so we don't want to like come from that space, right? We want to feel like, well, what is that about? Why am I feeling this? Why am I experiencing anger? Why do I feel irritated? And then once you get to the root, then you're capable of removing your emotions from that situation and saying, hey, um, yeah, when you say stuff like that, like it's embarrassing when you say it in front of people, or, I would appreciate if you don't comment about that. I'm pretty happy being single, Tia, right? Like whatever the comment is about, bringing it back to yourself, but it's important to react and not respond.
Yeah, I'm happy being single, Tia. I think that's something, that happens. We all have experiences with the tias.
No, you can always hit her with, "Where's your man?" I'm just kidding.
Yeah, yeah. Amen, right? Those with glass houses should not throw stones, and the tias are always quick to point stuff that we have going on. But I want to thank you for this enlightening conversation. I think it's rare that we open up about these things. I know a therapy setting is, very different, and obviously people become vulnerable. But outside of that setting, I think we, should be having more of these conversations between friends, even with friends that aren't having that experience or who aren't first generation, just kind of pulling them into what we're thinking or how we were raised or how this, generation of learnings is affecting us in the today. So thank you so much for bringing all this education.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I'm autistic, neurodivergent in multiple ways. So for me, it's never been a problem being a black sheep in my family. And I'm the woman who like nunca he tenido pelos en la lengua. And so I've been refining my assertiveness skills. And so I know to some people it doesn't come across as easy, but it's also, it's also off-putting when you're like the one always having something to say, right?
Yeah, no, I love the saying "no hay pelos en la lengua." I don't even know where that comes from, but I think it's fantastic, and there's nothing like it in English. Yeah. Well, we're excited to learn more about you. Where can people go and find you?
Yeah, so I am on socials. On TikTok, I am at Dr. Sandra Leon Villa. And then on Instagram, it's Dr. period Sandra Leon Villa. You're gonna find me mostly posting about liberation psychology, about things that are a lot of activism work. I'm really involved in my community and engaging in mutual aid. And then, also talking about just autism and neurodivergence. So you can find me
Yeah,
there.
which I think is also an important topic in our community. So thank you to bring awareness around it. So thank you so much.
Yeah,
And I'm very excited and grateful for your time.
thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.